Hi, welcome back to Work in Progress. I'm Asantua, and today we have Jeff with us and our guest Min. And today we'll be talking about the recent, very public Asian hate crimes that are happening. And yes, we'll take it from there. Could
All
everyone
right.
introduce
So,
themselves?
yes, Jeff, as usual, usual in the house, resident of Iceland, part-time chef, amateur photographer, cultural icon. No, just
I'm
kidding.
done. And Min.
All right. Hi guys. My name is Min. I'm an Asian American. I moved to Iceland about like a year and a half ago about. So I'm new here. And being here away from America since all this stuff has happened with the Trump administration has definitely been just I feel like it's a blessing. Like I'm really lucky that I get to be away from it and to see it from a different perspective, but it is definitely it's hard. Like it's hard to see people at home going through all of this and then it seems like it's one thing after another and now like people in my community are really hurting and it's just it's surreal, especially with COVID and the pandemic and being, like stuck in Iceland. I can't really go home yet. It's not really that safe. We just also had a baby, my husband and I, so it's just like a lot of things going on at once, it seems like within the last year. But other than that, new resident in Iceland. I love it for the most part. Like it's definitely different, but it's a really good place for us to raise a baby right now. So very grateful.
And I have to ask, as a new mom, how do you feel now having, I guess, a baby, and with all the things that are happening in the world, how do you feel like about protecting him now?
Yeah.
Because I realize that's like another very new aspect that you have to think about.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I used to be way more paranoid before I became a mom. Like I feel like I was always so nervous about bringing children into the world because everything is just so messed up. But since I actually got pregnant and was transitioning to this new role, I feel like I'm more calm now about it. And I'm just like, okay, I have a task to do. It's our job to teach our child, needs what they need to know to prepare them for how messed up the world is. So in a way, like I feel like it's definitely made me more balanced because I used to be like the person that was always like, oh my God, do you see what they're doing to us? And everybody would always be like, that's all she wants to talk about. But definitely now I'm like, okay, I know that's happening, but I need some time to just find my peace and, like protect my baby and my peace of mind mainly so I can take care of my child. So definitely, I thought it would be the opposite, like, but surprisingly, I feel like my natural instinct did me good. So
I,
Um,
I think we touched on a good point of reference. You said you're Asian American, and of course, I'm American myself. We have American backgrounds in this group. Um, Personally, it's interesting because I have a lot of points in my life that intersect. I have three brothers, and my youngest brother, he's married a woman from who has Japanese ancestry, and my oldest brother married a woman who has Chinese ancestry. And I have two nephews who very much look like a good mix, but you can tell they have Asian blood in them, and they live on the West Coast. And you know, so when in Iceland, when you talk to people, it's kind of like you kind of almost think you know everyone they know. And I think, especially with like African Americans, they think like all we know is African Americans. That's all we come into contact with. But as Americans, I think our backgrounds probably are a lot more diverse, and we might have family members or friends or so I think the news when it hits like the violence against Asian Americans, it hits us maybe different than it would like an Icelandic person who may not have as much of a diverse intersection of their friends or family. My point is that in Iceland, it's very interesting that these events happen and how Icelanders view it, especially coming from the protest that we had with George Floyd. What always sticks in my mind when we talk about these issues is what the reporters ask me: why should we care? From my point of view, when I grew up, my best friend Chang Kim was from South Korea, and another good friend of mine was from the Philippines. Ryan Bryant, his mother married an American soldier, moved back to the States. Another longtime friend of mine is Mexican American. His mother's, first generation out of Mexico, married a very white Irish fireman. My own mother married an Italian American. So my background is very diverse. And when it comes to issues like this, people are surprised at the level of, sometimes the level of, that I bring to it, of attention and awareness, and my personal feeling towards it. And I wonder, living in Iceland, like Sante just really put a head on, now that you have a child, does any of that lack of diversity concern you in any way? And how are you going to approach that with your child, do you think?
What a good question. I like that a lot. Yeah, because I feel like I never get to really talk about this. Like it's always in my mind and my husband's mind, and we talk about it with each other, but that's our bubble. And like, we have a diverse household. My husband is half Icelandic and half Black, and we originally met in the States. So we've been together for a long time. He moved here 3 years ago, and then we did long distance for a while, and then I eventually moved here. We got married and I moved here. So having our new baby, it's like interesting because it's like I never realized that it would be in Iceland where we would have our firstborn. So it's definitely like, okay, that I know that's going to be a challenge in itself, but I didn't really know it until I came here and was exposed to this specific society, because it's so different compared to where we're from. Because although it's very oppressive in the States, there are so many different types of people. So you have like this mutual feeling with certain people that you come across where it's like, okay, you kind of can relate to me, like there's these people, then there's other people, but at the end of the day, people of color, we feel a similar way compared to the white people. So coming here, a very white place, it was definitely like, wow, like I knew it was going to be like this, but I didn't realize how white it was. But yeah, so when we had our baby, like I knew, like I was always like, hey, like we need to find, like other colored babies for our baby to, play with. Because I'm always saying that. I'm always like, I don't want our child to be very sheltered into an image that is going to make him feel really weird, like definitely. Like my husband was born in Iceland, but he grew up in the States. So we like, I'm like, okay, you guys both were born here, but if our child goes to school here, he's going to have a totally different upbringing, and so we've had conversations about what we're going to do in terms of, his schooling and his upbringing. And we've had conversations where we don't want to be here permanently. We're going to try our best to expose our child to, I want him to have a more Vietnamese based upbringing. Definitely. That's so important to me. But I also want him to know that he is Icelandic. Like that's important to me too. So I feel like since we are privileged enough to have him be here and to be born here, he will get exposed to that. And one day when we do move back to the States and he gets exposed to that, I want him to be, you know, like when he grows up and comes back to visit Iceland, I want him to compare, you know, and really utilize what he has. So it is definitely a really important conversation that we have in our household about him being, you know, just in a very white world, Icelandic culture, and what we want for him to, you know, like, it's like, hey, you are going to look different from everybody else. So we do have to have important conversations. And it's like, hey, mom's family is in America, and, you know, there's a very big history behind that. So
Now,
definitely.
tagging in on that, do you find yourself having to explain your background to people here in Iceland? Do they just assume they know, you know, what part of Asia you're from, or do you find you're being lumped in as a group altogether?
Definitely the experience of being Asian in Iceland is definitely, I feel like, I don't know, I don't know how to say this. Like in the States, people already are stereotyping and they don't really care, you know, like it's like, oh, they group you and they're like, you're this color. But, and then they have these conversations with you that are just really not, yeah, it's like very shallow and they're just saying it to say it to pass time. But I've noticed that since I've moved here, it's even worse. Like, yeah, it's definitely worse. Like people, they're interested in speaking to people of different backgrounds, but it gets kind of like, I don't know, it gets kind of awkward because they don't know what else to say to keep the conversation going. So I don't know if that's just them not being educated in other cultures, you know, or if they just really don't want to keep it going. But yeah, definitely, I feel like there is more generalizations and stereotypes with Asians that I feel like the people in the States are more educated on, of course. So, and a lot of times I've noticed that since I came here as an immigrant married to an Icelander, it is totally like I get different stigmas, you know, like, but that's a different story.
That is true, I would say. As a foreign woman married to an
Yeah.
Icelandic person, it's very like there's a different set of stereotypes that get pushed onto us or me, I don't know. And so how did you, I guess I should ask everyone, you know, what were your reactions from the, I guess, from the mass shooting that happened in Atlanta recently?
Yeah, definitely that. I mean, the stuff with all of the anti-Asian hate happening right now in the States is it's worldwide. It's been escalating, and we and Asians have been feeling it. We've been feeling it since we all found out that we all found out globally that the virus was it's here, you know, like it's a pandemic. And in that moment, being Asian, we all kind of were like, oh, well, they're about to start acting some type of way because they know it's from China. So we were all kind of like in our minds, like prepared, you know, we're like, some stuff's about to go down. But it's been kind of just sitting back and watching it kind of happen because we've all been in quarantine and not really in society that way. So I feel like it's gradually escalated because people are slowly, you know, like going back into society. So people are like, all right, these people are frustrated. I understand. Like a lot of people, like these ignorant people, they have, you know, emotions and they go through things. And who knows, like by the end of the day, they're upset. They blame certain people, you know, so they attack certain people. And it's unfortunate that it is happening to Asian Americans because there's a lot of miseducation about Asian people. But I remember like talking to my friends about it, like, hey, like I know that I'm away right now and it's kind of weird asking you guys how you feel about it because I feel like I'm so sheltered right now in Iceland. And they would all just be like, you know, it's been happening. Like we all experience it in some form, but now it's like plastered all over the media. So now people are really feeling it, you know, and starting to take sides. So when the shooting had occurred, I remember just like I was definitely saddened, of course, but it was more so I was afraid for everybody that I knew. I was afraid for my mom. My mom is a nail tech. She works for an Asian owned business, you know, and I'm here. I can't do much to protect her or even explain things to her. And just really feeling helpless in the sense that we know that this is happening and it's going to keep happening to our people, but also being helpless knowing that I'm not there to help provide, you know, aid to my family or anybody in my community that needs, you know, like, because a lot of people don't speak English in the Asian community, the elders and people like that. So I feel like there's a huge lack of that generation actually knowing what's actually going on with politics and everything else. So I feel like people in my generation are just kind of like, we feel like we're in the forefront and we know what's going down, and we don't really know how to keep those like keep the older people informed and to fight for them, because they're not, you know, like when we were telling them like, hey, these things are happening to elderly people, all they can really do is hide. And we also have our own jobs, our own lives and families, you know, and it's like, okay, now I gotta really figure out how I'm gonna protect my parent who doesn't speak English, you know, and needs to go get groceries and stuff. Like it's just surreal. But at the same time, like I can't really, I don't know, because it's like I dig and I dig because I want like to feel some type of comfort in these situations, but then I realized the oppression is not limited to just my people, and there's such a huge history, you know. And so when these things come to surface, like you just feel really vulnerable, but you kind of know that it's not the end of it, you know, like as sad as that is. Like I feel like maybe it's because I'm American and I'm conditioned to just be like, oh yeah, whatever, next thing, please. Like
I feel as Americans, we are a bit desensitized because
Mhm.
it's kind of the Billy Mays, but wait, there's more that's coming along, unfortunately. And so, how did you feel prior, I guess, pre-COVID? Because I think that's one of the things that at least bothered me is that the Stop Asian Hate movement is, I guess, it's more publicized now because we have social media, of course. A lot of things are public now because we have social media, which is a blessing and a curse, I guess. Um, but I feel like hate crimes against Asian people are not new, and people don't seem to realize that. You know, we as Americans, I believe we had Japanese Americans in internment camps here. Um, let's not talk about, you know, all these wars that we've had bombing Asian countries. So none of this is new. So how did you feel pre-COVID with even just with stereotypes and I guess violence and the fetishization of Asian men and women, especially women, I
Yeah.
should say?
Big question. I feel like Asian Americans, we all, because it's like it's in our culture for our families to bring up and to expose us to why we are where we are. So if we are an immigrant, you know, who came to America because our homeland was bombed or there was a war or, you know, like situations like that, I feel like we have this mentality where we're grateful to be able to be in a better place than where we were. And we know that, you know, like back home is not really back home anymore. We left that place. So it's a different type of oppression for sure, because it's like it's bred within Asian culture based on the history, like way back before, you know, Asia was split up and stuff, and different subspecies of Asian people. I feel like it's in our culture to just take certain things and to just kind of keep rolling with it, because at the end of the day, like, you need to make that bread, you need to get that status. So I don't know if it's just the way that we're brought up in their family values, where we just kind of, we take it, you know, like we don't, I feel like Asian Americans haven't really been saying much about the oppression and the racism that they go through. It's kind of something where it's pretty subtle. I feel like when white people are saying these things, or, you know, like making these offensive, you know, remarks and stuff, like I feel that most people just take it anyway, because they're like, it doesn't matter, that, because in our mind, at the end of the day, with other Asian people, we're like, that white person doesn't know what they're talking about, you know, like, I'm here to help my family, like, you know, so we don't really take it to that level. And also personally, I've had a lot of different friends, like different groups of friends, and I have a lot of Black friends. And so whenever Asian people were like being subjected to racism, it was never on the level of what my Black friends were going through. So I personally just kind of looked at it like, oh, you know, them calling me a chink or a gook is not gonna really like kill me, you know, like, versus what's actually happening with my Black friends and the police and everything. Like, I'm just like, okay, that's irrelevant. There are bigger things to deal with. So it wasn't until recently now where we're realizing, like, people my age, my generation, you know, the millennials are realizing, okay, now they're like really starting to attack our parents and our elders, because we've been so quiet about how much this bothers us. So now it's like, now we're like, all right, we gotta, you know, start planning. But that too in itself is what makes me feel that, like, it's a little weird sometimes, because it's like, there's a lot about Asian American history that people don't really actually know about. It's much deeper. So, you know, just those kind of, I don't know, like, it's definitely weird, because we know as Asian Americans that this is happening to us, but we just take it anyway. And it's probably just a cultural thing that's ingrained in us, but now we're realizing it's not okay. Like, as Americans, we don't have to really deal with this shit. So sorry, pardon my language.
That's totally acceptable. That kind of segues into another part of what we wanted to get into, is the silence, because you know, for African American experience, we've always known of the marches and the protests. It intersects with lack of education that most Americans and most African Americans don't even know that after the end of slavery, that African Americans were actually in Congress. They were they were a significant part of getting on, despite what happened in slavery. There were, you know, one of the first women millionaires was a Black woman who was doing hair care products. These things aren't known generally.
Madam C.J. Walker.
Madam C.J. Walker, thank you. And I didn't know that until I was 30 years old, and I was in college in African American studies. And it really bugged me that I'm like, why the heck do I have to go to African American studies? It's American history. Isn't that like a great story of capitalism in America and coming from nothing and building up? And then as I learned African American history, interestingly enough, I got to learn about the contributions of all immigrants in America. And what I didn't know also was that Chinese people who had come and helped build the country were never allowed to become citizens. It was written into a lot of laws. There was a lot of, there were a lot of violence towards them as well back in the day, but those things were not in the history books. And so now we go through the 60s and everything, and all we see is Black people, and a couple of white people, maybe a couple of Jewish people even, in these civil rights marches. And I think in the mind of most white people would be, what did it, like the Black people always complain. These are the people that always are the voice, because we always see them. So when something like this happens, and there's been such silence about the treatment and mistreatment of Asian Americans, it's like you've suffered all this time, but no one's really known. No one's really paid attention to it because of maybe, like you said, that cultural silence. And when this incident happened, I worried instantly about my nephews. And the thing is that my nephews look like they have Asian background, but to the ignorant average American, they might mistake them as Puerto Rican. so it's like, that's how the ignorance, I think, almost saves them a bit. I don't know. And for my nieces and nephews whose mother's Japanese, my niece, she really has the features. She has a straight black hair. You can identify her. My nephew, not so much, but you can tell a little bit. And I worried about them instantly. But what really got me was with the press conference, when this white police officer goes, "Oh, so-and-so was having a bad day." That blew my mind, that a grown-ass man, just 10 people are dead. That's 10 families. That's exponential amount of pain in a community, exponential. And he's talking about the guy had a bad day. What in the is in his head? And he's like he's in charge of policing. That told me so much. But come to find out that he had a Facebook post talking about the China virus, like Trump. So was it surprising? No. But I tell you, that really pissed me off. There's always these crazy white guys shooting up things. And it's always like for me, being in Iceland, I cannot tell you as a Black man how many times I have come across a single white female and I've become stressed because I know that they perceive me as a threat. And it's the last thing in my head until I see someone. Then I'm like, well, I got to watch everything I'm doing. I stop walking as fast. I slow down. I try to make myself into something else. And that's my experience. That's how I've been kind of conditioned by the world around me. And having said that, does this incident, and now this more attention paid to Asian Americans and Asians in general around the world having to deal with this, it's in France. I saw incidents in London. It's cowardly to go after an elderly person. I don't even understand that. But just in general, does this heighten your sense of who you are in the world different than before this because of the attention that's paid to it? That's kind of the question I'm trying to get to.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's I feel like there's a lot of Asian Americans who hide behind, whatever sense of privilege that they feel they have. And that could, go into the minority complex, and we could talk more about that. But it definitely is a huge eye opener, and a lot of people are finally realizing what it means to be Asian, whether it's like, hey, okay, we're not white, we know that. I don't personally, I've never been able to identify as that. So to me, I'm just kind of like, all right, like, growing up, like, it was always like, when you are raised in America and you go to school in the schooling system, and it's so diverse, and like there's different subcultures and schools and stuff, and then you realize like, hey, where am I gonna conform, and growing up, I felt like in high school, I did have a lot of white friends, but they probably wanted to be friends with me for whatever reason, you know, and then eventually I realized that I was friends with people that I couldn't trust, you know, and I was just like, all right, like this is, I don't identify with this. This is making me feel weird when I'm in certain situations with them. And so with that, it kind of just, it makes, it's a personal, I feel like it's a personal journey for every person of color to realize, hey, do you know where you're really from? And are you educating yourself on it? Because there is so much to learn once you finally have that realization. And definitely, I know what you're saying in the sense of like, hey, like this is causing a huge ripple in the Asian community, especially with younger generations, and realizing, hey, do you know why your parents are here? Do you know why these people are bullying and literally attacking your parents because they think it's funny, you know, like, and that is where it hurts, because we're realizing like, hey, I contribute to society, but then you realize, no, they actually don't respect me at all, not one bit, you know. And even though they may let me sit in certain seats, they still, you know, they call us coronavirus, you know, even though they know, or if they don't know, that there's different groups of Asian people within, you know, like our national or our race. But I definitely feel like there is going to be a huge uprising of Asian Americans finally realizing that there is a fight to kind of prepare ourselves for, because a lot of them are not active in activism and understanding what's really going on in American society right now. A lot of them are, you know, like I've noticed a lot when with the Trump election, like when he won, and realizing how many people, Asian people, voted for him. Like, you know, that in itself is like, whoa, like a lot more than I would personally prefer, you know. But just stuff like that, making, and then like having to, like, because once we realized that was going on, we started to have more conversations with our families about like, yo, you can't be doing that. Like, these people do not care about you like that. You can't be like, hey, I voted for Trump, let's have this conversation. Like, no, it does not work that way. So unfortunately, like during those moments a couple years ago, it was really awkward. I feel it's like a weird phase where we didn't really know who we could really trust and talk to. But since Trump's out of office now, I definitely feel like I can, you know, see who I can side with, and now we can actually have these important conversations. So,
And so on that note, since you saw how many Asian people were voting for Trump, do you feel that was, how do you say it? At that point, and I guess now looking back, do you see how, I guess, in a way, do you feel those Asian people wanted to be accepted in like that society? Like they wanted to believe that they were on that level or acceptable in that part of white supremacy where they're like, I'm like all you other white people because I also voted for Trump, and you know your, I guess if your features are soft enough, your skin is light enough that you could be, I'm acceptable. I do not look like the others. And do you, I mean, do now that he's out of office and you see the people that are not as trustworthy, do you feel like it was kind of them being manipulated?
it's a very good question, because I want to talk about this, because like looking back now, like with what you're saying, definitely like it's interesting how well, first off, like when these people are like, yeah, openly, you know, like MAGA, like I support Trump, that enough was like, whoa, like what do you mean you support Trump? But like they really were riding that boat, you know, like they rode it to the end. And then now it seems like I don't really know where they went, you know, like they're pretty quiet right now, but definitely they were
Because
riding
they're
that
not
wave.
really on that. They're not. They found out how much they cannot really be on that wave
And
these days. It
it's
seems.
also very telling in itself how scary it was for Asian people who were supporting him. Because once the virus was present and he was, you know, addressing things about it, it was like a huge reality check for people when he was, and I feel like even when he was literally calling it the China virus, a lot of Asians didn't really realize what that meant. Yeah, like it definitely, like I remember when that was happening, like the anxiety that I had, that whenever I would see the stuff, you know, on TV or on Facebook, and I was like, oh my God, this is going to start a huge race war. Like, and he's doing it on purpose. And I would have conversations with, you know, like older people, older Asian people, and they didn't really see it for what it was yet. They were just kind of like, oh yeah, it's okay. Nothing's really gonna happen. And I'm like, no, he's purposely doing this stuff because his supporters are gonna start doing it for him, you know? So definitely it was a huge reality check for Asian people when he started to do that.
Now,
I don't know how the supporters or the Asian supporters feel about it. I'm sure they felt really embarrassed and were humiliated and just kind of started, you know, taking a step back. But it was definitely a pivotal moment.
Right before we came on, I saw this in the Washington Post that a top GOP candidate bashes Chinese immigrants over coronavirus and says, I don't want them here at all. The top GOP candidate is Sari Kim, who's Korean. So I found that, like, and if you look at her, you say, well, they probably figure you're Chinese too. So you don't get what you're doing. You have no idea what you're doing. But she's like a GOP candidate, and she figures that's the ticket to go on, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, you know, they've beaten up an elderly Philippine woman in the state. They don't know, you know, so it's like, is it Asia, the whole continent we're talking about here? Is that what
They do not care, Jeff.
Yeah,
Anyone, you know, like, I mean, not that I'm angry with you, like they just don't care.
no,
If you look any kind of Asian, like that is their goal. But that's the thing, I guess now we always knew about white supremacy and dominant white culture, is that it's easy to identify others. As a white person, how do you look at another white person and see that they are Italian American or Irish or Russian and then go beat them up?
yeah,
White is the
that's a
default.
good point. But also, like maybe you had touched on men about immigration or being an immigrant and married to an Icelandic person. There's this, like, what is the instant perception? It's like, well, you're coming from crap, so you should be appreciative. You know, it's that white savior complex that is super dominant. Like everywhere else in the world where white people are is crap, and that's the reason that everybody comes to, you know, Europe or comes to the United States. It's the, you know, like the immigration we have at the Mexican border in the United States, you know. Well, it's crap there. Okay, why is it crap there? Because American bombs, American intervention, going back to Reagan. Can we like go into that a little bit? Can we go into how the CIA has propped up dictators all around the world that they could puppet, and let alone like democratically elected governments around the world that have been subverted by American policies, white European policies. So, I mean, that notion has to be discarded. And it's ignorance that perpetuates that idea that, like, when I came here, you know, I came here because of my wife. It wasn't my first choice. It wasn't even my third choice. You know, if I had a choice.
Say it, Jeffrey.
I
Say
mean,
it for these people.
You know,
Say for all of
Some
us.
people think like we were like, Iceland is the goal. That's where we need to go. And I'm like, this wasn't on my radar. I'm so
we're
sorry.
coming to the promised land of milk and ice honey. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. And like, you know, it's not that people immigrate for out of desperation all the time. You know, I think that's perpetuated, and that's just a kind of, that goes to that deep-seated, ingrained white supremacy that even people of color and minorities have to kind of throw up out of themselves, because it's so, it just takes away the richness that is in this world of people and of cultures and of backgrounds. And you know, in Iceland, it's so unique in that it's so, I lived in the south of Iceland for a while, and a good friend of mine who did my computer network was an Icelandic guy, and he had married a girl from Thailand, and there was no one around from Thailand for her to like engage with at all. And some of the negative stuff on the periphery I heard just like totally pissed me off and blew my mind. Now, considering I was also alone out there in the wilderness, it was rare that I would be in a position to correct someone or say something to somebody, because my wife's position in that particular community, for a lot of times I felt I had to be silent, like, and then like I went to a local election thing, and it was just me and my wife, and it was nothing but Icelanders. I walked in, and it was like in the movies, the record scratched, you know, when I walked in, you know, and everybody got quiet, literally. And I was like, what the hell is, and this is because my wife said, you know what, let's go. It'll be fine. Don't, you know, we're going to participate in the local election, you know. And just some of the stuff that I heard after a few drinks about this woman and about women, Asian women that were in the area with Icelandic farmers and whatnot, was very offensive, but there was no one else there to like say anything, you know, say anything against it. It was a perception of desperation. That's why they're here. And, oh, you know, they're trying to get something for nothing or whatever. And I'm like, how the hell do you know any of that? You
I
know,
feel that's the first, that's like the Icelandic go-to for foreigners, it seems. Because especially like I said, for people that they can other, it's very much a different experience for a white American woman who comes here and marries a white and Icelandic man. You know, the most they really have to do is really learn how to speak Icelandic, and then people give them like, oh, you're Icelandic now, you're doing really well, this is good for you. Whereas if you're black like me and you speak Icelandic, usually people are really surprised when I speak Icelandic, and they're like, oh, you know, I get the, how long have you lived here? Why did you come here? Especially being from New York, they're like, why did you come to Iceland? You should have stayed there. It's better. Older people do think, oh, did you come here like because you want citizenship? And I'm like, no, this was not on my list of places to live. I'm so sorry to tell you that, but no. So I feel that's
Which
like
is offensive.
yes,
I
it
want
is.
people to know.
Yeah, they think that's like the go-to thing, like, oh, you came here for citizenship, and I'm like, no, I didn't. I'm not enjoying this that much, where I decided to come here and settle and steal a passport, you know, swindle someone out of this. I think that's their very much go-to thing, and also I think Icelandic people with their whole tetaretas thing, it's like, oh, you know, it's not really my place to say anything, especially if you don't have Asian friends. They're like, why should I say anything? This doesn't affect anyone I know. They just stay quiet, which is also white silence is white violence. So you have to say something when you hear
and
these things.
on that point, getting to a conclusion maybe towards this is, what do you think would be something that would be a positive step in the direction and just getting to a place of at least having some empathy here with people? Me personally, I think education is the key. I think what we learn in school, what we're taught in school, what's important in school. I talk to my wife and other teachers that I know, that I think Iceland being what it is and having the populations that that it seems to be having and growing in a little bit, needs a better approach to their education, because knowing people's value and worth and culture helps stem maybe a lot of this prejudice and this lack of concern about issues that affect portions of the population that reside and contribute to this country. What is your idea on that aspect of it? Because I know my kids growing up, any education that comes from African-American other than Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks comes from me with my kids. They don't get any of that in school. Icelandic history, of course, is absent of any very much foreign intervention as far as I know. And what do you think would be a positive step in that direction, besides from Menningarnótt, like cultural night?
Cultural. Okay, yeah, definitely. It's very hard to get certain resources when you're trying to educate yourself on other groups of people's cultures, or just just trying to learn about their history and their oppressions, so then you can kind of put the pieces together to kind of understand the actuality of reality right now. Because I don't know, I feel like you're right, like how most of the stuff that we learn in school is really whitewashed, and they're writing the books, so we just retain what we get. And it's super important that we teach our children our own stories. And growing up, that was a huge deal in my family. Like, I am a second generation immigrant, and my parents came to the States when I was like 1. We left, they had me in Vietnam and then left like right away. And then we're refugees in, like, I think it was like the Philippines, like went through a lot of stuff before they actually got to go to America. So there's a lot of stuff that when you're in those situations, when you're an immigrant, you're a refugee in a foreign land, you experience so much trauma that you want to be able to, you hold it so dear that eventually you want to let your children know what you've been through to get them to where they are now, So I kind of have that in me because my parents taught that to me. So I am really grateful that I have parents who do that. That's not always the case, especially in Asian households in America. A lot of times, like, I have friends that don't even speak their mother tongue because their parents want them to assimilate to the point where they are straight up American, so they lose their heritage and they don't even know where to go. And that is really sad, when I see that happening. So definitely, that's why I was saying in the beginning, like, I was so worried about Raheem. My child's name is Raheem. We're so worried about what he's going to retain when he's finally like in school. So definitely, and I'm like, because if I could, I would just homeschool him and teach him, like, I'd be like, all right, we're learning this part of the world today, and their history and what they've been through, because to me, that's important. I never got to have that type of history lesson growing up in the States, going to public school. It was very, very white. And I remember like learning about slavery, and I was like, what, like 3 days? Like, it was like 3 days. Like, you don't really learn anything. They don't really say much about it. They just are like, oh, this happened. Next chapter. So yeah, definitely. We are making sure that, I'm trying to teach him what I can about my cultural background. And then my husband is teaching him what he can from his background. So just being a mixed family, we are really aware of how confused he's going to be growing up, because he does, like you said, like, your nephews look really, past Puerto Rican, like, because they're so mixed. So with my child, I feel like he's going to be going in society and people are going to be like, what are you? And he's going to be like, oh, I'm Asian, white, and black, and people are probably going to give him weird looks just for that. Like, you must come from some weird family. But in reality, it's like, at the end of the day, I'm having these conversations with my child. I want him to know what has happened in the past, and that he can, definitely never do that in the future. Because a lot of us didn't really get those lessons from our parents. So it's time to, put that back into effect. I think it's super important. That's also probably why there's a huge lack of education in a lot of people's cultures in the States, because people just don't know where to begin and how to have these conversations with their kids. They feel like kids shouldn't be talking about these things. And I definitely think that's definitely not the case. Like, you need to be telling your children what's going on. Because if the kids are in school and they're on the playground and they're, like, imitating parents, what they're learning from home, and they're being racist to other kids, or, just, bullying people because they don't know any better. Like, once they go home and they're being scolded for it, you should also kind of, give your baby a little history lesson. Like, a lot of people are not doing that. So these kids think it's okay to just keep treating people like that. So
that's why I think it's
education
on the education, because knowing a people and their contribution in America, it should be a non-issue. American history should incorporate all of those who have contributed, and it doesn't. And in worldwide, even like, we talk about ancient Greek culture is the pinnacle of education, and it's such BS, because if you read Plato and Aristotle and the ancient writers, if you actually start studying, you realize that much of their knowledge came from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And it's like, but no, when you go to college, it's Greek. What is that all about? It's like, that's not education. That's like this. So, and it's easier to characterize and stereotype when you only see people as two-dimensional or one-dimensional. And unfortunately, this happens for African-American women, especially, are often like seen as this angry Black woman, or, mammy kind of roles, so they don't know anything about Ethiopian warrior queens. They don't have nothing, Nefertiti's attributed to, when they think of Nefertiti or any of the African queens, they think of Elizabeth Taylor, for God's sakes.
Do they think of African queens? Let's start there.
There are so many of these whitewashed things about what we are educated about that makes these kind of issues and violence against these our minority communities easier to cope with. I will just, from my own stamp on this conversation, I would like that the whole understanding of African-American comes from the fact that when you see a person of color, a person who's Black is the only, when they say Black people is not, it doesn't tell you much about the people. Black is a color, it's not a culture. And we're the only people in the world that get called Black. And, otherwise you have Italian, you have, Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese.
I like
Black.
to call Black.
Where is Black? Black is not a country. Black is not a continent. Black is
Black is a cultural experience, though.
Yes,
I
but
feel like
what I'm saying, in terms of how prejudice gets perpetrated, and the reason why I find that whenever you have like Black Lives Matter came up with so much resistance, and I'm like, how can you argue against the term Black Lives Matter? It's like, well, all lives matter. Well, obviously. Now, if someone says Asian lives matter, I'm going to say yes. It doesn't even pop into my mind to go, well, I think Black Lives Matter. I think all lives matter. That kind of attitude never occurs to me as a human being. But if you've been culturally that white is the best, of course, then everything else falls off as secondary. And knowing the world, white is the actual minority. in the world. And the best thing that white supremacy can do is separate each minority. And it's been very successful in doing that. That, like there's been a tension amongst the African American and Asian community in the States, and tension against Jewish community and Blacks in the States. And it's like, even in the beginning of the colonization of the United States, there were more African people enslaved and Native Americans than there were white colonists. And it's like, if they really wanted to, they could have just kicked them out. But the whole divide and conquer is something that, as humanity hopefully evolves, instead of me seeing you as Vietnamese or African, I see you as who you are as a person and respect where you come from. But I see you as who you are as a person first, because these stereotypes, like, when you think of Asian stereotypes, it's such a vague thing, and it has nothing to do with the different countries that we're talking about and the people and traditions and histories that are there. Same thing with Africa. It's like, when I grew up, I thought Africa was one place, one thing, one of every, and there's like a diverse tradition and cultures there. If we can have an influence on the education of people in general, Black, white, Asian, whatever, just our education needs to be serious, not whitewashed, in education, women included. I mean, the contributions women have made throughout history, the average male doesn't know, or isn't like, has no respect for. It's just like, it makes us less than what we can be. So I think education is key to a lot of issues that we see, and we got to stop buying into going along to get along. My voice will be just as loud as any other Asian's voice talking about these issues, because I think it matters. Because Black lives matter. Now Asian lives matter. Well, who's next? Who is the white police officer going to say had a bad day, and is excused? And it's always, have you ever noticed, it's always, he was mentally disturbed or something. But if it's some other minority, it's like, well, you see, if it was, if the guy was Muslim, we'd have it'd be a whole different thing. But this is a white guy who's angry for some reason. I thought you were the best. I thought everything was great. These are guys that are always going around shooting up people because they feel like, hey, everybody else is disposable.
These are valid points, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to put a pin in that one, Jeffrey. So I think you both made excellent points. Education is definitely essential. I think not even just on a macro level, on a micro level, like Min said, she wants to teach her son about her culture. And I think that's amazing and essential for all of us to do. So I'd like to thank Min for joining us today, and Jeffrey as usual. So that was another episode of Work in Progress, and thank you for watching.